Hi, my name is Jason Marzak. I'm the director of the Latin America Economic Growth Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin America Center, and I'm the moderator for this next discussion on overcoming labor market mismatches and the role of labor intermediation systems. We have a couple welcoming remarks, a presentation of the book, and then we'll get into the panel. So let's start off with the welcome remarks. First, I'd like to invite up Hector Salazar. Hector is a former professor in Mexico and since 2007 was a main advisor to the Department of Social Sectors and has been the manager of the division since 2013. Hector, please come up for some welcome remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jason. I will be very brief, but I really need to say something. You know, the previous panel was fantastic. And I really don't know if I could name it like the manifest for the full freeing of the labor force majority of Latin America or against it. I don't know, because all the discussion and the dimensions, you know, like, you know, the variation of productivity. So we know that that happens structurally in any economy. Then we know that there informality, we know segmentation exists, and we know sometimes unfairness situation exists, but also unemployment insurance make possible, I guess at least, to ameliorate a little bit the transitions as the harder ones as in Spain. But in Latin America, we don't have that. So segmentations are different in different geographies. And also, we are very clear that Silicon Valleys cannot replicate it, right? We haven't found that. We never will find that. But that brings us a little bit of what I'm going to briefly mention here as an introduction for this panel, that it is coming back to the center of these presentations, and it is the importance of the public good, importance of generation of information for the supply and demand side in the labor markets, and also behind that the institutionality, the institutional structure that it is needed for implementing regulations, norms that imperfectly they may be, then they exist, and we have to really pursue always to improve constantly all of that. So it's the encounter of the public and the private sector. And it is behind the Silicon Valleys, it is behind all these intermediation issues, it is behind how to administrate unemployment insurance, it is behind all the structural factors that occur in real time, real geographies, and in the short term. Also very important for politicians and policymakers. So public employment services are behind this. And they are challenged by expectations of growth, changing conditions, and the labor market and institutional context, broadly speaking. In order to have a good understanding of public employment services around the world, it is important to have a clear picture, of course, of what is happening in the labor market and how they are operating under new challenging conditions. I would say that there are three dimensions that are always behind this, structurally speaking. One is demographic changes, globalization, secondly, technological changes, and also the issue that preoccupies us, and we've heard our colleague from the World Bank, rising inequality, that are some of the important current employment, public employment services challenges. In demographic terms, Latin America and the Caribbean are still experiencing large increases in the labor force. The number of young people, of course, goes in hand with an increase in the number of older persons in this generation and generations forthcoming. Global competition, we know, is a driving rapid and ongoing restructuring processes, placing importance on ongoing businesses, innovation, and labor upskilling to improve productivity and competitiveness. We know that. Which leads us, of course, to talk about technological changes, which is the shift towards a knowledge-based economy that offers opportunities for development and advancement. But there is a risk of these opportunities, as we've heard before, that will be taken up unequally. In many countries, new knowledge-based jobs coexist with large numbers of low-skill and low-paid service jobs, low-quality jobs, what we've heard also in the previous panel discussion. Therefore, public employment services really can assist as a critical getaway in the new kind of economy towards which the world is moving. No doubt about it, the availability of structured and comparable information about public employment services would make it possible to better inform dialogue, activities, and technical and financial assistance initiatives regarding labor markets. It is at the core of what Carmen presented in that vicious or virtual possible circle that explains what is behind the structure of labor markets. Hence, we would like here to thank especially the World Association of Public Employment Services and the Local Economic Employment Development Initiative of the OECD for this joint effort that aroused some light to new challenges for public employment services. And we are very pleased to have this second panel, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Hector. And I think a lot of the comments that Hector made are issues that we're going to touch on more in depth in the panel. I'd like to now invite up Sylvain Giguère, the head of the OECD Division for Local Economic and Employment Development, and a 20-year veteran of the OECD. Sylvain?
Thank you very much, and thank you for revealing my age. So I'd like to thank the IDB and WAPES very much for this very good collaboration, which led to this book, which I think is very timely. There's growing interest in the contribution that public employment services can bring to address employment, social, and economic issues. Stefan mentioned an example of that with the G20, which put that topic on its agenda last year, and we were quite surprised. So we were also very happy to bring a contribution, and on the basis of which the G20 have a mention in their declaration, which indicates the importance to improve the professional capacities of public employment services. And this is something that is very important, as the book shows. So what is the fuss about public employment services, which after all is just a delivery body attached to the Ministry of Labor? So many people could say, it's not very sexy, and what could it change in our challenges? And I think the reason is the challenges that we discussed so far this morning. I mean, we mentioned the demographic challenges. We talked about youth who are entering the labor market with a scar, which often they will keep for the rest of their working life, unfortunately. Technology destroying jobs, job transition that happen very often. Migration is another very important topic, as our workforce is becoming more global. They do not necessarily have the right skills in the country where they go to, but at the same time they bring a number of assets which we can build on, and often it is the capacity to set up a new business. And the productivity issue, and that's very important. It is connected with informality in places like Latin America, but we also need to realize that this is an issue that we are facing in all our countries. So we had a very interesting discussion this morning, I think, talking about the role of gazelles, but at the same time, from 60 to 90% of the workforce often work in SMEs. And what do we do with these SMEs? And often it's because they're focusing too much on the short term. There's a lack of incentives, as it was mentioned. And what's happening is that we don't know how to make the best use of the talent that they can build on. And it's a question mark for the whole policy community. How can we help them to move beyond a short-term horizon to a longer-term horizon, and make a better use of the talent, which can lead to innovation within the firm and improve productivity, which can in turn create better quality jobs. So to address these challenges, basically we need to radically change the way we implement our policies and deliver our programs. And the Public Employment Service is an important actor in this new approach that we may take or may not take. And we talked about the role of labor market policy so far compared to other policies, and indeed it's about taking a more integrated approach. It's about better coordinating labor market policy with vocational training to avoid that people fall through the cracks of the system. and also giving the possibility to upskill those who are already in employment. And it's also about connecting labor market policy with economic development and SME support, for example, making sure that we can address the needs of local businesses and also to make it possible to anticipate and to seize the new economic opportunities. That's not so easy when policies are a bit rigid, and that's the case for labor market policy and education policies. We need to work with employers to build career ladders that will help those who don't have so many qualifications to progress in employment by moving from one job to another one, sometimes from one company to another one. This is very much labor intensive, but it is key to help the low qualified people to build a better life and create a better job for themselves. We need to work with employers also to fill this productivity issue and to make a better use of the talent that is available. And that requires a very integrated approach, because there's no one single policy that can do that. There's no one single actor locally. It's about the role of employment services, which can often see what are the problems of companies in terms of productivity, but they need to work with universities, community colleges, with economic development agencies, chambers of commerce, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, and unions, because unions sometimes they have an idea about what is not going optimally in terms of work organization. So to cut a long story short, we need to build strong partnerships on the ground. And this is what this book is about. And in this book, we're looking at the conditions for this to happen effectively. So we look at the degree of flexibility that is necessary in the management of policies, and namely labor market policy, in order to be better used in a better way locally in coordination with other programs. It's also about the capacities. Capacities are key, because to address those productivity issues, it's very, you need some intelligence, you need some data, and you need some good cooperation with other stakeholders. And thirdly, this is about this cooperation. You need to develop strong accountability relationships, not only vertically, but also horizontally between the various organizations. And that is something that is not easy. So this book is looking at the situation in advanced economies, but also looks at these particular issues in the context, of course, of emerging economies and in particular Latin America. So I hope this book will be used, because it has a lot of good ingredients for making progress on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvain. I'd like to now invite up Miguel Peromingo to give a perspective from the World Association of Public Employment Services. Miguel is the regional advisor for the Americas region. Miguel.
Thank you very much. Good morning. WAPES is representing 85 public employment services all over the world, and we put this study out there to also show how diverse they are. They are public employment services that are over 100 years old, very elaborated system, a lot of experience, and there are public employment services that are 3 or 4 years old and are with a new enthusiasm of a new organization trying to get a hold, trying to get coverage on the market. So that's a big difference between these two and between these two groups. And also the coverage is very different, and also the partnership structure is very different. So this study is about this, also to show that there is a lot of differences in capacity. Basically, no matter how old public employment services are, how successful they are, and how big coverage they all struggle with the same things. And from an internal point of view, or from a, let's say, capacity point of view, those are 3 things that go, from our point of view, through the entire list of our members. And that's, one of them is that public employment services have a lot of knowledge, but they sometimes lack the skills inside the public employment services, the skills of the staff to deal with the changing world of work. One example is, for example, at the moment we have a lot of struggle worldwide in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, with migration, with labor migration, and we see that not all public employment service staff members are ready and able to deal with the changing perspective that brings. So it's one of the main tasks is to upskill staff of public employment services. Partnerships, we have heard that many times. One of the main partners of public employment services is the private world, employers. One of the struggles that public employment services have, no matter how developed they are, is that they don't always get the right jobs, and they don't always have the right contacts to employers to get people into jobs. into good quality, decent jobs. And the third thing is that the capacity is sometimes limiting. We have public employment services that hardly have the infrastructure to make phone calls, to go into the internet. And we have public employment services that are have such an overcapacity that they are rather dealing with the opposite extreme, which is administrative burdens, red tape, etc. So one of the tasks we have and one of the objectives of this study is also to show that there is a lot of enthusiasm, knowledge, and ideology to help people into work out there, but we need to step up on the capacity to make that happen. And for that, we're very happy that we collaborated with the IDB, because especially in the Americas, one of the focus that in the last study we did in 2011 was a little bit too short. We didn't have a good capacity of public employment service response there. This increased a lot. We learned a lot through that. And also the partnership with the OECD that told us a lot about how to do partnerships on the local level. So we hope too from WAPES that this is a study that's going to be used and that will help public employment services and their partners to make the world a better place when it comes to decent jobs. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Sylvain, and thank you, Hector, for those opening remarks. I'd now like to ask Dulce Baptista, who is the coordinator of the Employment Service Network, and also, importantly, one of the many co-authors of the book that is being launched today, a book that is a must-read for everyone in this room and beyond this room. And Dulce has the difficult task of taking this excellent book and distilling it into a short presentation. So, Dulce, please.
Welcome, everyone, to the World of Public Employment Services. Before I start, I'd like to introduce you to my mom. She's back. Mom, could you please wave for us, please? Thank you. So, my mom had one job her entire life. She was a teacher. And her story is very different from David Pena, this young Spanish man who had 135 jobs over the last 2.5 years. David's story made me think about Dora, my daughter, who will be getting the labor market and the challenges she will face. Well, the world of work is changing, right? Today, 77 million of people are migrating to work abroad. In 2015, 1.3 billion of people work remotely. And today in the US, 77% of employers recruit through social network sites. Of course, that all these trends will have important implications over public employment services. And you know what public employment services do, right? No? Not a problem. I have a video for you.
זה נשמע כמובן. זה נתרום.
אדוני הנשיא, סיימת כבר לארוז?
אני עובד על זה.
מצוין. חשבת מה אתה הולך לעשות ביום שאחרי?
גם על זה אני עובד.
אוקיי, אז איזה ניסיון יש לך?
הייתי רפתן ממדרגה ראשונה.
הכל עכשיו חליבה אוטומטית.
הייתי גם רועה צאן, ולא איבדתי אף כבשה.
עכשיו כולם טבעונים.
הייתי שר דואר. גם דואר נכנס וגם דואר יוצא.
עכשיו הכל במייל.
אני הקמתי את רפאל.
מה זה מסעדה הזו? למה ככה יקר? תגיד.
זה לא המסעדה, זה רשת לפיתוח אמצעי.
אז אין לך ניסיון. תחפש משהו. קווה לטוב.
שלום, 95 מלא.
שמן מים?
לא תודה.
Well, they are clearly not making good use of Mr. Perry's skills. And if by working with this old-fashioned mentality to insert one person in a particular job in a particular moment in time, public employment services are losing the opportunity to become key players in the world economy. And how they can do that? Well, they can foster skills development and they can do right skills matching. And by doing so, they can create a virtual cycle helping to improve people's employability and countries' productivity and competitiveness. So the new reality requires a new mentality, and that is supporting people through their various transitions they will experience. But the million-dollar question is, are they ready to become, are they ready to become key players in the world economy? The truth is, we didn't know. So we partnered with WAPES and OECD, and we surveyed 73 countries in 5 continents. And of course, we learned a lot in this process. And today I'd like to share with you 3 things we think that will be very important to take public employment services to the next level. The first thing is looking at skills matching with a life cycle perspective. And to do that, you need to update your skills services to the new reality. You need to focus on those skills you can take from one job to another. And in Flanders, for example, an unemployed baker can use a tool in the public employment services to inform not only the experience, form qualifications, but also those transferable skills. And through a report that's produced, the public employment services in Flanders can quickly convert an unemployed baker into a confectioner. But a fancy set of skill services is not enough. You need people and you need firms using those skills. And unfortunately, the reality is in some regions, the coverage of public employment services are very low. In Latin America and Caribbean, for example, less than 10% of employers list vacancies in the public employment services. And with low coverage, you have to have partnerships. And in Honduras, they know that already. And the public employment services got into a partnership with employers' organization, and the employer organization gets staff, materials, and the offices, and the public employment services with system and methods. And together, they managed to increase the number of employers using the public employment services from 112 in 2004 to over 7,000 in 2013. The number of job seekers increased from a little over 3,000 to more than 25 in 2013. So partnerships are very important, right? The second key thing we think that will be very important is making a strategic use of technology. And in the Netherlands, during the financial crisis, the public employment services lost half of this budget in a moment that the number of job seekers was increasing dramatically. And they managed that, right, by heavily focusing on electronic channels. They set the goal that by 2014, 85% of the clients would be using online services. They did that. Initially, customer satisfaction declined, but now it's back to normal levels. The trouble is that not every country has that digital coverage, and not every country has population with those skills yet. And in Sweden, for example, they use a blended approach, right? So a job seeker in Sweden that has problems using online services, they can click in a tab and a staff of the public employment services can access the screen and help them to complete the process. And another thing that we find very interesting is that even in emerging economies, they're increasingly making a move toward more sort of technology-driven processes. In Colombia, for example, the public employment services developed an app to connect job seekers and vacancies. The third thing is something that we talk about today, that it's good governance. In the 90s in Mexico, they wanted to develop luxury industry, tourism in the Riviera Maya. The trouble was they had a low educated population. They had training education systems that didn't provide them with the workers with the skills they need for the luxury hotels, right? They didn't have an intermediation system that could provide them with enough good matches fast enough for the needs. So they had to work together, right? They formed this partnership, in which the employers would give internships so teachers and students could get to know the realities of the industry. The schools, they updated the curriculum so they could actually meet the needs of the new industry. And the public employment services developed special products, a dedicated website to provide them staff, job fairs so they could get in contact with as many job seekers as possible. That was possible because they worked together and they had the good governance in place. And because of that, they were able to make the Riviera Maya we know today. Well, we are already living in the new world of work. And if public employment services continue to work with this old-fashioned mentality, they won't become relevant players. Countries need workers at the right moment with the right talent at the right place to be competitive. And we can't afford to waste talent as we did in the movie with Mr. Paris, right? So it's very important, and we strongly believe that through the right approach for skills, strategic use of technology, and good governance, countries will have a powerful tool to face the labor market challenges in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Before I go, I would like to ask Roberto Flores Lima to get up, please. So, Roberto is one of the authors of the book. He was one of the driving force behind of this book. He retired last year from the bank after a whole life dedicated to public employment services in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I thought it was very important to acknowledge that and said that I'm very sorry. We'll keep disrupting your retirement, but we can't afford to lose your talent. Thank you, Roberto.
Have any videos like that to show during the panel, so we'll just have to make up for that in our comments. Again, my name is Jason Marzek. I'm the director of the Latin America Economic Growth Initiative at the Atlantic Council, the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and I'm thrilled by the invitation from the IDB, from Dulce and Carmen and others to moderate this panel, and we have a fantastic group of panelists in which we're going to further explore many of these topics that Dulce mentioned during her excellent presentation. To my immediate left, let me just quickly introduce the panelists. I'm not going to read their full bios. I think you have that, but to my immediate left is Ramona McDowell. Ramona has worked in the Employment and Social Development Department of Canada since 2003 in a variety of different areas. She's here for 2 days, Ramona, down from Canada to enjoy the warm, balmy weather of Washington from Canada. She's focused in technologies to help learning and literacy, essential skills for the workplace, active employment measures, and she, among other things, is the Canada representative for the World Association of Public Employment Services. Next to Ramona is Richard Walchrist. Richard is one of the 100 most important experts in staffing, and also one of the most important spokesmen for the sector in the world. Is that right, Richard?
I think my mother gave you that.
Yeah. Well, she might have even said one of the 5 most important, right? Richard is the president and CEO of the American Staffing Association and a member of the board of directors of the International Confederation of Private Employment Services. To Richard's left is Aneesh Chopra. Aneesh is somebody, and I don't think I got this from your family, Aneesh, but he's somebody who President Obama himself praised for his work as the first technology director of the United States. He was the person who coined the term open innovation, and has been consistently working on visionary issues to improve public management using technology. He's currently the main advisor for the advisory board company and Albright Stonebridge Group, I guess in your spare time. To Aneesh's left is Bruno Crépon. Bruno joins us from Paris, where he's a professor at NCA. He is also, among other things, part of the board of directors of the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which is a lab that makes randomized evaluations of social programs and where he co-directs the employment program. So thank you, Bruno, for coming in from across the pond to join us, and to all of our panelists. Now, the panel today, we have a couple goals of this panel, and I'm going to talk to you and a couple of different things that we're going to focus on. I think, as we start this conversation, what we're going to try to accomplish as part of this panel is to put forward some proposals of how to solve this job skills mismatch and what could be some of the role of technology in doing so, some of the issues that Dulce mentioned in her presentation, and then also generate some ideas of how government can be a facilitator rather than an obstacle to innovation. And then finally, also highlighting the role that the IDB and other institutions can have in fostering public-private partnerships that address some of the challenges faced by public employment services. So that's our homework for the next hour. We're going to conduct this in a Davos-style discussion. There's no formal presentations. We're going to keep this as conversational as possible. And we'll leave time for questions and answer from the audience at the end. I understand there's no cards that will be floating around for people to be writing their questions on. So let me start off with you, Ramona. We're first looking at the broader term of the broader idea of labor market shifts, right? And we've talked a little bit about how precarious employment is very high, and in many cases is rising due to the growth of the gig economy. I'm sure many here know what that is. In case you don't, it's an economy in which workers are employed on a particular task for a defined period of time, and that's very much a trend. And so, to what extent is this precarious nature of employment and the growth of the gig economy, and among other things, how is that resulting in some type of fundamental realignment of the job market? What are some of the implications of that, Ramona?
Well, I don't think I can say anything new that we won't have seen in the OECD report, The Future of Work, or the Davos theme on the fourth industrial revolutions. I think we're all aware of the bottlenecks that have occurred. We have older people that perhaps might like to leave the labor market but are unable to do so because of the devaluation of their savings or the more precarious nature of their work. So they're continuing on in the labor market and blocking the new labor market entrance. We've heard already this morning a lot about the issues around young, uneducated males, and particularly being very vulnerable. The fact that we can no longer count, if we ever could, on a career for life. I think it was a privileged minority that used to be able to count on that career for life, but definitely the hollowing out of these middle-level jobs where it's easier and easier to break up skills, like for a new lawyer that might just be doing more research work instead of appearing before the court, that can be easily outsourced. We see a lot of this happening in the accounting and corporate services industries, a lot of offshoring of these types of jobs.
And Bruno, I mean, all this implies that workers find themselves searching for jobs more often than before. How are some of these changes, I mean, how are they affecting the French economy? But you've also studied economies around the world. And how are some of these changes affecting especially some of the economies in the developing world?
Well, it's true that if we consider first France, it's true that we have seen a rise in the precarity of employment. For example, if you consider the share of job seekers, of workers with temporary contracts, fixed-term contracts, so it has risen over the 80s and the 90s, then it's quite stable. But the new phenomenon which appears is the fact that we have a very, very large increase within those fixed-term contracts of very, very short-term contracts. And actually the number of workers working on such a contract has more than doubled within the last 10 years. And so it's, of course, something which is very, very complicated. So in the report, I read that one thing that we may have in mind to fight this phenomenon which is also exists in the developing world is to look at unemployment benefits. So that people are not trapped within the present, are not forced to take the first job coming. Well, actually, the ironical thing is that in France, some scholars say that it's exactly related to the fact that you have unemployment benefits, which lead to this rise of the precarious jobs. And the reason why is that in France, people can keep their unemployment benefit while taking a job for a short period of time. So it provides incentives to people to, while being unemployed, take a very short-term contract. And I think that's something which is very interesting because what it says is that behind general ideas, you may the details actually can be quite important. If we think about changes, about, for example, having unemployment benefits in developing countries, then probably the details will have a lot of importance in the impact later.
That's a very interesting point, Bruno. I'd like to get back to that later. Richard, we're using this term precarious employment. And I think it was you and I were discussing before, it's a term that's used a lot around the world, but maybe not as much in the United States. And I think just the nature of it can have a negative connotation. So first, should it be viewed as such? And then also, I'd like your perspective from a private sector point of view of what you see as some of the implications of these changes in the labor market.
Sure. So first off, thank you all for inviting us to be part of the panel, and we have had a chance to take a look at the book. We find that it's really spot on in terms of identifying some of the big challenges that we're facing in every country of the world. The group that I represent is CIAT. It's the International Confederation of Private Employment Services. I'm on their board of directors, and I'm also part of the American Staffing Association. The CIAT group is really the private sector version of WAPES, and we do the same sorts of things in terms of matching talent with opportunity. Our members represent country federations in 50 countries around the world, and we have a number of large multinational corporate members, and we engage at the international level with all of the same groups that you work with. We have some sensitivity about the use of language. In the United States, one of the terms that is used by our federal government to try to get its arms around non-traditional workers is contingent. And if you talk to the people who are working as contract employees or contract professionals, terminology matters. They don't believe that they are contingent, which might be a synonym for peripheral, on the side, supplemental. They're advancing a career path in an entirely different way. And we can talk a little bit about the difference between the old traditional career ladder and now career lattices. And I think that that's really, you've got a visual depiction of that on the front cover of the book. That it's not going to be the kind of progression that you might have seen in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. It's a different kind of a world. The same sort of term and sensitivity, I think, applies to the term precarious or precarity. And if you look at some of the definitions that are being utilized at the international level, I think it's commonly understood to mean a type of employment that is insecure, is unprotected, is sometimes illegal, and doesn't generate enough income for an individual to support a lifestyle, his or her family. To lump new ways of work under old titles, I think really does us all a disservice and kind of keeps us wedded to the past. And so for our industry, the group that we represent, Aneesh and I were talking a little bit about the industry and how it's grown. 40, 50 years ago, you would hear about temporary help companies. One of the terms that our members try not to use when they're onboarding talent is it's a four-letter word, and it's TEMP. You come to work for me, and I welcome you in as a temp. And you go on your first assignment, and you describe yourself as a temp. And sometimes you use another four-letter word. You say, I'm just a temp. Well, you're not just a temp. You're a fully formed human being that's making contributions to society and to your family and to the company for which you're providing services. We do a lot of work at the international level with many of the partners in this room in terms of trying to solve some of the big social issues, raise people up out of poverty, incent employers to create better jobs. So thank you for the opportunity to address that. We think that terminology matters, and we're happy to work with all of you on being as precise as we possibly can. In terms of the changing world of work, as Ramona mentioned, at Davos and multiple forums here in the United States that we've participated in, everybody's launching symposia on the future of work and what it's going to look like. And we know it's not going to look like it looked in the past. It has significant implications for individuals, and individuals are looking at the world of work entirely differently in the United States and around the world, in every country that was affected by the economic crisis. So for my sons, who are millennials and they're part of the workforce, they've gone through two recessions. The first one in the early 2000s, and they were both a little too young to assimilate it, but the most recent one, they saw their friends, fathers and mothers and aunts and uncles and sisters and brothers lose their jobs. And these were committed people. These were dedicated people. These were people who had plaques on their walls, Employee of the Month and Employee of the Year, and all of a sudden, why did Mr. Mansfield lose his job? It's because economic cycles happen, and economic cycles are getting shorter and shorter, and whether we like it or not, while employers give lip service to the most important resource that they possess, which is talent, it's also the most expensive. And so when sales go south and one has to now trim costs, one of the costs that they're going to begin to trim at some point are people. So for millennials, for my sons, who took a look at their grandfather who worked for the same company, the same corporation for 37 years, on the one hand, that's their view of job purgatory. They have short attention spans. Working anywhere for more than 6 or 7 or 8, let alone 37 years, is something that just doesn't appeal to them. They are much more entrepreneurial than prior generations. And so they're taking a look at some of the themes that are touched on in the book in terms of creating a better sense of work-life balance. They've got good educations, and so they're people that have probably better opportunities, but even for them, the real takeaway is that job security in the United States and all over the world is defined in an entirely different way than it was for my generation, certainly. My generation continued to view job security as being tied to an employer. And if you worked for a blue chip firm or a multinational and you did a reasonably good job, you might have the kind of job my father had for 37 years with the same corporation. It will never exist that way ever again.
I'd like to get in the panel about how some of this is going to be affecting the way that the employment services work. I'd like to turn to Aneesh, though, first. And Aneesh, as we've been talking about how the labor force is getting more older, more urban, more global. As Richard was saying, changing jobs more frequently. As Dulce began her presentation with the person who was changing jobs, I think it was over 100 times, 105 times. What does this mean, especially what does this mean for the role of technology? I mean, technological change is altering the demand for labor at an increasing pace. And how do you see this technological change altering labor markets in the U.S. and around the world?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. Let me put context, then I'll answer the question. When the president asked me to serve as the chief technology officer, the role I was to play was to close the innovation gap on the presumption that the way technology had been deployed in the private sector had achieved such tremendous advancements that maybe in the public sector we hadn't had the same level of benefit, or we hadn't fully harnessed all the capacity. And among the most important questions that I had asked before we get into the mechanics of what does it mean for the future of work was the following. The role of government in the traditional sense, I'm a student of the Kennedy School, I had been trained that the role of government in some cases is to provide direct service delivery, so we provide a function. In other cases, we actually regulate, in which case we sort of set conditions on how the labor market is to operate. And in other cases, we are purchasers, purchasers for the purposes of delivery or purchasers for other reasons, whether it be education services or others. And in all these dimensions, there had been this lack of appreciation or harnessing of technology's role in any of this. And my initial hypothesis upon coming in was that what we might consider is that there's actually a fourth role of government in the information age, and that in many ways is to harness and publish data that could make many of the sectors perform better. So we talk about the role of, quote, technology in the economy. In many ways, there's a more fundamental question at play. For every employer looking to perform a service that will help them generate income and contribute to their firm's success, there are people around the world that could be tailor-made to perform the function that that employer needs. Now, technology means that perhaps a global relationship might mean an internet connection and I can perform the work. Technology also might mean that through an internet connection, I can find the fact that this person needs my labor and I have the skills to fill the need. So there's a sort of clearly an important role for technology in closing the gap geographically between individuals. But it's also important to understand the role of the public employment services in helping to figure out whether these folks will ever meet. Forget whether I can physically show up for work and whether it's a short-term assignment or a longer-term assignment. That will be predicated on the nature of the work itself. But the more fundamental question for our society is, do we have a labor market that thoughtfully exposes the demand signal? What is it that's truly in demand, either at the very micro unit level, I need a person to drive this package across town for delivery, all the way up to any other larger, there's a huge plant coming and it's going to have a demand for a certain type of worker. That is information. And the traditional public employment model had been, well, you kind of have to ask I play golf with the person who's bringing the jobs. We're going to offer some economic development subsidies. We'll build a program custom made for that big economic project. But so many and that's the Riviera Maya, large top-down planning, right? But then there's these bottom-up. I'm an employer and I've got an idea and I'm going to bring 3 employees on board. Where does the public employment system hear that demand signal? And how might that demand signal then be made broadcast so that the schools, training programs, service providers, whether they be public or private retail delivery, can harness that signal in order to make a better match? Conversely, we do a terrible job defining the skills that people have. Our federal government in the U.S., we define every job in America in one of 935 occupation codes. So what's your code? What's my code?
I could never find mine.
And how are we supposed to communicate that code? In the public employment systems in the United States, everyone who files for unemployment benefits must basically self-determine the code they're in. And it is that code, that one of 935, which is the basis of the match. This is absurd. My LinkedIn profile can have up to 50,000 possible tags. So there's information about the skills that we possess, much as there's information about the skills that are in demand in the labor market. And long before we solve how technology disrupts employment, whether it's telework or temporary work, or maybe a shorter term work assignment, let's think about the role that technology could play to get at the most fundamental level. Does our public employment system, do our economies have perfect or near perfect information about the demand signal right now and the labor pool available? Whether we do the matching or a private firm does the matching, do we have that information out there? McKinsey, I'll conclude with this, published a study a year ago, May, and found that the friction in the labor market, our lack of understanding about the talent pool on both sides of the equation, is constraining global economic growth to the tune of $2.7 trillion. So clearly there's an opportunity for us to harness the full power and potential of technology. And in the US, we've got to like fix broken systems and then get to the better place. In Latin American countries that haven't made the bad decisions on the old broken systems, maybe you can leapfrog and get it right on the front end. And so there's a chance to think about this in many ways.
And I want to go back to that, Aneesh, when we talk about specifically how can we rethink the idea of employee-employer skills matching and have a broader conversation on that. I think first in the context of, as we're thinking about how the labor market is shifting, both today and how it will shift in the future, is thinking then again, what does that mean for public employment services and private employment services, and how do they need to change, and how can both be more effective in this changing global labor market? Ramona, turning back to you, how do you see, given everything we've been talking about, public employment agencies adjusting in order to be able to deliver high quality and effective services in a rapidly changing labor market as we've just outlined?
Well, I think very much what Aneesh says about the transparency of the labor market. It is a huge issue, and it's not just an issue for public employment services, nor is it an issue that they can solve alone. And I think, I think the four basic pillars, or the three pillars, the sort of the providing employment assistance and placement services, developing and sharing labor market information, being perhaps a deliverer or a middleman on the training side. I think those key pillars of the service will continue, and for the about 1/3 of countries in the report that actually manage unemployment benefits, I mean that will continue too, because we think of it as being, just maintaining a subsistence for someone, but it does assist with mismatches in creating that space for somebody to find a better match than to just go for the first available and then into this cycle of churn. I think those three things will continue to be very important. I think in terms of where we're seeing the changes are when we talk about employment assistance and placement services, far more emphasis on the routine type of things to be handled on a self-serve basis. There's even consumer demand for that 24/7 access to, I need to file my claim, I need to report on this, I want to check on things. So you do see a lot of resources being allocated, and it's not just when we think of the richer countries, but we see countries in North Africa and a lot of emerging countries looking at this as a better alternative than to building bricks and mortar centers. And I mean, even in Canada, it's quite a rich country, but we have, for example, in Nunavut, you've got 900,000 square kilometers with 50,000 people in it to build bricks and mortar centers in villages of, 150 people. It's not very cost efficient. So, I mean, just as public employment services have been squeezed and cut staff, just the way other, companies did, private sector, during the recession, this allows some reallocation of resources. So I think there is really a shift of reallocating resources to in-person services for people that really need that. We see that wraparound supports lead to a much better match, lead to much better persistence in the job market. They help those people that, these untapped resources that are around the edge of the labor market that we are going to need, because even in the Caribbean, I mean, the demographic shift and in the Latin American, it will come. It's just not at the same point it is in, say, Germany or Sweden, but it is coming. On the labor market information side, I think rather than just sort of a job openings in here, resumes in here, kind of mix it up and see what falls out the bottom, we do see much more usable and useful applications being developed with the end user. More of a private, when you want to book a room at the Hilton Hotel, you go on and you say, this city, this night, this type of room, bang. So we're seeing a lot more matching, not that it's that easy to match somebody with a job, but we see that model is being looked at. also labor market information that's useful for the people that work in the public employment services, you know, so they can be more proactive, more predictive, do a better job up front. The training, I think you're seeing less sort of bums in seats. We're going to buy a block of training, get people there, but more looking at transferable skills, because we're training for people for jobs that don't even exist yet in some cases. Entrepreneurship skills, we see a rising emphasis on this both in public employment services and in school systems, because people in this so-called gig economy, or however you want to term it, you're going to have to remarket yourself a number of times. And we see, particularly, there was WAPES had an event in November that looked particularly at workers over age 50. And one of the issues that came out with these people is it's not necessarily that they don't have skills, but they have very specific skills. And so having that entrepreneurial bent will help them market those very specific skills.
Based on your research, do you agree with Ramona? And I'll confess, I asked the panelists before to not always agree with each other. So hopefully, Bruno, you have a somewhat different take from Ramona based on your research of how countries and labor innovation services, and specifically public employment services, should be adapting to this new context.
Well, I think that if we consider all the services which are provided to the job seekers, they are not coming for free. They are all they require means and money. And so it's very important when you consider those various interventions, those various services, to know whether or not they reach their goal. Usually they have been conceived because you wanted something to be achieved. So it's very important to know whether when I provide different type of intervention, when I have a supply to offer to the job seekers, is it true that those services they achieve their goal? And actually, that's exactly what the Poverty Action Lab is doing. It's looking at impact evaluation. So trying to know when some job seekers, we've considered the case of job seekers, if some job seekers benefit from some services, is it true that it helps the job seekers? Is it true that we see evolution in their career paths which are consistent with what we expected at the beginning? And when we see all those services which are traditionally offered, training programs, access to job subsidies, information, well, the picture is rather grim. It's not frequently the case that you see a positive impact on those all those services. Training program, unfortunately, there is a big hope, but it does not work that well. And the only thing that seems to work in many places, including developing countries, is providing information to the job seekers. It's the only type of intervention that I have seen with those, requirements of doing random access of some job seekers to some services, that you see then a positive impact. There is an experiment like that in India. There is one in the Philippines about job fairs, where you see that just having people participating in a job fair make a substantial difference. And that's the only place where we can see impact. So I think it's very important when we consider those new interventions to identify whether or not they work.
Bruno, you spark some. Oh, please go ahead.
Well, and if I can jump into what Aneesh said before, I think it's a place where there is a huge room for improvement. If you consider, for example, job seekers now, for example, in France, job seekers, when they fall into unemployment, then for them it's a very long process to find a job back. And sometimes it needs to take a lot of different decisions, which are very complicated to do. For example, you have sometimes to think about what are your opportunities, what are the chances that you will find a job in the next week or in 2 months or later. It's very difficult to know that. It's also very difficult to know what are the other opportunities in other sectors, because there are geography, but also sometimes it's necessary for people to change their their market and to acquire new skills and to make new plans. Okay, and this in all those things you need to have a knowledge about what are your chances. It is very, very difficult to know that, you know. Even if you have a lot of information, it's very difficult. So something which somebody is currently doing in France, it's base impact. They are doing big data analysis in which they take a lot of information all around the web which exists, and they try to combine this information so that it's directly usable for the job seeker, so that they know whether or not they will stay for long unemployed in their own market, what are the alternative things, so that this choice, all those choices are so complicated to make, they are easy. And we are currently working with them and in partnership with the Public Employment Service, because you cannot do that without the Public Employment Service, to know whether or not these things improve there's great chance that it works, but we need to know what are the gains.
Bruno, you've sparked, I think, an intervention from Aneesh and Ramona. I'll both respond quickly, and we're going to, you know, unlike the presidential debates that you see, you know, almost nightly now, the rebuttals to the contrary will be much more respectful than what you see. But Aneesh and then Ramona, and then I want to turn to Richard afterwards to talk about the private employment angle of this.
I was on a panel with Larry Summers where he quoted Esther Duflo's study in France on this subject. He remarked that what I was describing was an evasion from the core issue because of the fact that you found no evidence. And I want to provide context for why you may draw the wrong conclusions from those studies. When I was in the Virginia government, before I went to the White House, I was Virginia's technology secretary. I visited a community that had 20% unemployment on the North Carolina border. All the jobs had been lost to China for making furniture and textiles. And I observed people asking the Employment Training Center, can I see where the jobs are for me? And I overheard someone say, oh, here's an opening 135 miles away. I said, oh, that's very sad. So after the discussion, I went to the staffer and I said, show me the computer. What are you looking at? And he said, well, the government's given me this application, and I'm searching it for the jobs. And I said, okay, let's take a look. And then I said, you know, my next appointment is with the hospital about a mile away. They have over 25 job openings. They have a shortage. They can't fill them. Show me their job postings in your system. Oh, they don't put it in our system. They don't put it in our system. I said, why do they have to put it in the system? Whereas this thing called the internet, their job postings are on this thing called the internet. And what I was told was the public system basically, rather than playing the role it was meant to play, which is to think about how it can capture the understanding of the labor market, constrained the delivery system to whatever vendor they bought the product from to deliver this. And what you were describing about this software may be better is what is purchased by government, by contractor to deliver these services. And it has really weakened our capacity to provide the role of government. When President Obama in August asked employers, please make a commitment to hire veterans, my job as tech guy was, how do I find the jobs that were associated with the president's commitment? Do they have to do, like in Virginia, where manually enter this in some government website? No. I called Google, and I said, how would you think of this problem? And they said, this is called search. We've thought about this a great deal. And, oh, by the way, if the government encouraged the use of an open data standard, maybe we could find every internet job posting with the word veteran commit. 30 days later, all the search engines agreed on a common open standard. All the employers, kind of through their HR systems, kind of voluntarily agreed. And 90 days after the president's speech saying, I want you to do this, we launched the Open Veteran Search Tool. We had 500,000 jobs had already been tagged so that they could be identified. Not because the government made them enter it somewhere, but we used like regular, normal, rational, open internet services So a judgment about the accuracy of a training program, which I thoroughly would accept would be bad on many measures, signals that you shouldn't maybe look at that investment when perhaps the root cause of the problem was the information gap, and that the public sector could play a smarter role in closing the information gap. And we're going to talk about President Obama's in his budget announced a $500 million fund for a workforce data science initiative so we could get much better about the rigor of understanding the demand and the supply signals. So maybe that's delivered through a retail government-funded operational service. Maybe it's opened up so that the private services can deliver the same. I don't know. That's a different debate. Who should the retailer be? But at least the role of government, we could all agree, is to get the information, the labor market information, so that we can make the economy work better. And we've failed in that capacity, at least in the areas where I've studied.
Can I do a plug for you, Aneesh? This is your virtual workforce connector, which is a idea written about in Democracy Journal. And I know I want to get to Ramona, but I want to ask, are there any, just a quick follow-up, what are there any drawbacks to this potential model?
So this is if you run a government Department of Labor, here comes the problem. You want to deliver a service. You want that service to be amazing. So you build an operating budget and you request the government to fund it so that you can buy the list of jobs, build an internet service or a desk clerk job system so that the people on your payroll can do their jobs to the best of their ability. And your limits are whether you can ask for more money in the budget to fund better tools and toys, maybe train your staff better, maybe you do something. So we've always thought of employment service, public service delivery as a governmental budgeted item that needs to be, fought for and delivered. What the good and the bad, if you thought about the role as a wholesale provider of labor market data as the first job of the employment system, you'd spend every incremental dollar trying to figure out what are the jobs that are in the community. Some of them are on the internet, many of them are not. Some of them are, on a job board posted on some, maybe a billboard that's got, I need a person to build my lawn or something, to clean my lawn. So you could invest on the margins to get the data. The drawback is you have no certainty that if you release that information, it would do anything. Maybe a private staffing agency grabs that information and makes their own services smarter. Maybe a local government version of a workforce center grabs the information and makes them smarter. But you don't control it at the federal level or wherever the level is that you do the analysis. So my theory is if we spent more energy on getting the data out, collecting it and out, ever better, maybe at the skill level, et cetera, we are at risk that no one does anything with it. It's like that tree in the forest that falls that no one knows. If I publish an open data set in the woods and no one knows, does it actually help someone get a job? But if we can, the theory is, create the conditions that encourage many users. I don't want just the public employment and just the private employment. I want every employment entity. Maybe the guidance counselor at the community college. Maybe a friend or a neighbor that wants to help a friend or a neighbor. And the point is, we should spend our time on organizing the data and then go selling it to every potential user of it so we can get the information in the hands of the people that need it most.
I want to bring Ramona back in, who I know you had some comments based on Bruno's presentation. And then I want to turn to Richard. We're bringing up the role of the private employment services in a lot of different regards, so I'm going to turn to you afterwards.
And I think this sort of brings both points together that certainly, we do know from evaluations, and I think, the public employment services are very aware of the need to evaluate because we're all taxpayers too, right? We all want value for our dollar. You really see things like wage subsidies, there's the dead weight issue or failure. It's usually because there is a lack of good labor market information, and what is really critical is to root these services in the local labor market, to really understand what the assets and challenges are there, and that having that labor market information and really knowing your local labor market helps you build the partnerships that get the expansion, that create the ripples around your services.
So, Richard, I'd like you to think. We've been talking a lot about the public employment agencies and how they should be adapting. I'd love your thoughts on the private employment agencies, and then specifically also your reaction to Aneesh's idea.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm delighted to hear. I've read a little bit about it, and this is really kind of in the epicenter of our world. You hit upon one of the real challenges we all face as we're trying to get the match right between talent and opportunity, and that is, you know, bad data in, you get junk out. Few among us were ever taught to write a resume, and those that might have been instructed didn't do a very good job. Our members see this every single day, and so do you. Veterans is a very good example. I loved your film. I mean, here you've got a guy that's got a pretty good job resume, right? But you know, you pump that into a traditional system, and you come up with big zeros. We've got a firm here in Washington, D.C. that actually kind of does that for people who are men and women that work up on Capitol Hill. These people have tremendous positions of responsibility. So maybe you were the chief legislative aide to Nancy Pelosi, and you go to a private sector firm and they look at your resume and they go, Aneesh, do you have any marketable skills? Yeah, that's great. You did all this stuff. So it's an organization called Polytemps, and they basically say, let's spend some time with you. Let's actually pull out the kinds of things you do. We do the same thing with veterans groups. I mean, exactly the same things. And Aneesh touched upon the fact that you've got all of these little meta tags, right? The state of the art of technology in our industry was that people were doing the old Boolean searches, and they were like trying to scrub the internet. I mean, they would soak up every little bit of data, and they would, you know, punch in terms. Fortunately, technology is enabling. And so all of a sudden now we've got really smart people that are writing some really crazy good algorithms. So they can like separate the wheat from the chaff. And a couple of the companies that you're working with, I'll introduce you to a couple more. It's making it easier and easier and easier to uncover the skills, but it really starts again with what I'm posting on Indeed and LinkedIn and Monster and Career Builder. So that's where our role comes in, as consultative partners with the job seekers. I mean, it really has to be one-on-one. We could spend some time talking a little bit about getting the match right. I mean, because it's actually rather easy to match technical skills. It's a lot harder to actually make sure that it's also a good cultural fit for the individual, that they've got the right kind of soft skills to succeed in that position for as long as they need them. So we see the same sort of challenges that you're all facing. We're delighted with the cooperation that we've been able to achieve around the world. I mean, because the idea here is to take the growing number of unemployed and try to match them with the growing number of open job recs, right? So the ILO has recently put out an estimate that in this year, 2016, we're looking at 200 million people who are unemployed. And yet, one of our members, Manpower, they do a big global hiring survey. 38% of global employers are reporting they're having a hard time filling jobs today. So there are opportunities. We've just got to do a better job of you know, making sure that we've identified the skills you all possess and the skills that folks need. That's kind of short term. If we take a look at what technology is doing, and maybe this will key up another conversation, another study that most of us have heard a little bit about, a group of Oxford Economics has talked a little bit about, you know, the enabling side of automation and robotics and artificial intelligence, and the other side of it. And the other side of it is that their forecasts, and they're not the only ones that have said this, but they looked out 20 years. So by 2045, they believe that which is now less than 20 years, 45% of the current jobs today will be rendered redundant. They won't be done by human beings. And so this is all of a sudden causing people to freak out, and this has happened during every major revolution. I mean, we had the Luddites, and we made the transition from agrarian to industrial society. And it's serious stuff, and it's not just the pickers and the packers and the logistics centers for Amazon. We're talking about redundancies for my friends that went to law school. And all of a sudden, you touched on it, all of a sudden now, we're talking about reporters. They've got artificial intelligence that can come through every single related case that used to be junior associate would go through stacks and stacks and stacks. So we're talking about a fundamental change for every occupation except for yours, because you're sourcing talent and you're going to be job counselors. And I say that with all seriousness. I mean, this element, there are some things that automation can do, there's some things that they can't. I mean, sitting down and talking to, and maybe it's not in person, maybe it's virtual. Increasingly, we're using those kind of channels. But I mean, drawing out the opportunity that this person has to succeed based on their training and experience. And this is what we're doing today. At the same time, we're trying to lower expectations. I mean, you probably face this as well with employers. Employers got spoiled during the recession. Our talent benches were never as deep as they were in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012. And it gets to the example that you gave. I mean, you know, it's this kind of, you're not seeing the opportunity right in front of you. You're wedded to job descriptions of the past. You know, let's look a little bit more creatively at what you absolutely need to get that job done. And let's see if we can either fit the person into it or we can find an opportunity to do some training and some upskilling. And I think that that's really where in the United States and around the world, I mean, that's going to be the future, and the private sector is really going to have to step it up. They're really going to have to make a commitment to upskilling and to retraining. And it's beginning to happen, but just around the edges.
You know, Richard, I think those are important numbers to highlight again, staggering numbers, right? I mean, over 1/3 of employers are searching for the right workers, even though you have unemployment rates at highs in many countries. And I think staggeringly, nearly half of the jobs that we have today are going to be redundant. I mean, that's really scary for many people. Bruno, what is, you know, as we think about these trends, how do you see the role of things like job search counseling? How can it be more effective when compared to other labor market policies, such as training and subsidized employment, insofar as helping workers adapt to these changes in the way that in this?
Yes, job search programs, they have been one of the cornerstone of employment program for decades. You know, if you consider active labor market policies, you have those services helping to match job seekers, and you have productivity enhancing interventions. And so job search programs, they have been found to be very effective. And when I spoke previously about providing information, this is basically what those type of programs are doing. But actually, I think this is something which is very nice. It is good to have in mind that providing information is something which is important and that it helps job seekers to find a job. But the thing which is also important is to have the job, to have the vacancies. And frequently, those interventions have been criticized for long by the fact that they might help some people to find a job, but it's at the expense of others, and that it doesn't create job. And the thing that you need is job. If you want to match job seekers with vacancies, you need to have vacancies. And what we did in France, working with the Public Employment Service in close partnership, was to run a randomized control trial with a specific design which were able to provide some knowledge on this issue. And the results that we have obtained is really very interesting, because it shows us that it's true that when you help a job seeker to find a job, to find for a vacancy, well, this guy will find a job more quickly than other guys. But we were also, because of the specific design that we implemented, we were able to show that the competitors of those guys in the labor market, actually their chances to find a job worsen. And that when we tried to look at the whole, what were the number of job seekers who found a job because of the intervention, actually the number was very, very, very small, because of those just redistribution of vacancies among job seekers. And this was particularly important in weak labor market. That is, when the number of vacancies is small, then in this case, what you do is just to have people rotating into the queue to get employment. So I think that's something which is very interesting. And the next step with our partnership with the Public Employment Service, based on this experiment, was to say, well, if it doesn't work so well in weak labor market, to help the job seekers. So let's go to the firm and see whether we can understand the process of firms to open vacancies and to provide assistance to job seekers so that for them it's easier. Because for a firm, it's complicated to open a vacancy. You know, to have to define what you need. You have to write down. It's so complicated to properly write down. You have a lot of laws. You cannot write down your need in the way you think about them. You have to use the specific words. It's complicated. And then you have to screen the job seekers. So it's costly. And a lot of small firms cannot afford. They don't have a human resource manager within their firm. And so they cannot do that. And so frequently, they prefer not to open a vacancy. And so we did this intervention with the Public Employment Service, and the results are quite amazing. It increases the number of vacancies by 10%.
Oh, my God.
Wow. And the number, and what we saw is that it increases also the number of jobs available, but we also observed the fact that within the firm, that there was a strong substitution to good contracts versus bad contracts. For example, those very short-term contracts, we saw that they were strongly diminishing within the firm. And they were replaced by those permanent contracts that we like so much in France.
Wow, wow, that's great. That's a huge number.
Yes, yes.
A couple questions from the audience I've gotten so far. One's for the panel, but I'm going to turn to the one first for you, Aneesh, which actually replaced the question that I had for you,
Okay.
which is public employment services around Latin America. They're making decisions on their technological platforms, right? What's the best way? And I think maybe this was even in Dulce's presentation or one of the welcome remarks, that there's even a potential for countries in the region to even leapfrog using technology, right? So what would you recommend to countries in Latin America that are making their decisions on what's the best technological platform?
Yeah, so this is a really difficult conversation because my advice may not make you feel very comfortable. Because if you were to say, I want to buy technology for public employment, your tender to request those services will emphasize more of that actual interface between the seeker and the counselor, or that online 24/7 version, where you're just spending money to do something that really isn't unique to being in the public sector. That is something that anyone can perform. However, if you start asking these questions, that's a new one that I hadn't even thought about. Where is the database of openings that we know of and hidden openings that we could make available had we done this? To me, the technology I would invest in is in understanding the job landscape. If you had the best understanding of where employers were looking to hire and didn't just buy it, but thought about the broader question about the role of government. In the US, if you're a government contractor, you're obligated to post your openings on the internet. That's a regulation we impose actually for veteran employment. It's called the Veterans Employment Law regulation. So you could think about what are the policies that might allow you to bring technology in for purposes of building up that demand signal. I think that would be the cornerstone. If you don't know the best inventory, then you can't even get off the gate to match, because you're going to have the problem where you think the person's getting, you have fancy software, but there's no job openings, and you're going to tell your poor job seeker, I'm sorry, no jobs for you, when that's not a true statement. And this idea is another related one. It's a data question. How do you find the hidden jobs? So that would be, my view is pure, simple, collect that base information and expose it. And many of you countries have data.gov platforms where you can just publish these files on the internet, and then you can encourage civil society to bring life to them in a very clever way. It doesn't cost very much money.
Yeah, Richard.
I could just kind of tag on. If you haven't done this, and you could certainly contact me, we would love to be able to try to work with you and open up our databases. One of the things that you touched on was, as part of the recession, we've seen a lot of big firms have either eliminated or they've reduced the size of their internal HR departments. And in some cases, the HR departments around the world became kind of, regulations police, as opposed to really, good at doing recruiting and building talent pools and developing talent pools and redeploying talent pools. So if you can kind of get in sync with the information that our members have, because I mean they're actually taking over now this function. You've probably heard of RPO. It's recruitment process outsourcing. And while it may seem a little bit painful to think about that kind of a function that seems so integral to the business, it came up in the panel this morning. Businesses are reconfiguring themselves. There was a fellow by the name of Charles Handy. He actually was one of the founders of the London School of Economics. Some 20 years ago, he put together a monograph, and it was about the Shamrock Society. He kind of predicted what we're seeing today, that the three leaves of the Shamrock, and one leaf would be the core workers, in whom would be the institutional knowledge of the organization, kind of a traditional workforce. And then the other two leaves, depending upon product cycles and economic cycles, would be flexible workers. They'd be short-term temporary workers, and he really didn't envision the gig economy and all of these independent contractors. But this is the way jobs are being reshaped and corporations are being reshaped. And the idea, again, with the folks that I represent, again, there's no charge to the talent ever. We're trying to make the match for the people that don't have the jobs with the employers that are looking for them. So I'd encourage you to use that resource as well.
Another question that I had in the audience as well is what could be, we're here at the IDB, so what could be the role of the IDB in helping this transformation of public employment services and I'll throw in there as well private and partnering potentially with private employment services given the changing nature of the economy and all that we've talked about insofar as the labor demands and how to better provide for a skills match. Ramona, I'll start with you, but I'd like the perspective of everybody in the panel.
So I think the IDB brings all the important strands together as the economic development, the social development. I mean, you can't increase employment without all these threads. So I think they're very well positioned with this global view. And, they're also very hands on the ground. There's a lot of capacity building that's really rooted in this understanding of the economies that are part of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Richard?
I think that for IDB and for countries really need to be taking a look at the skill sets that are in demand today, and then do a little bit of forward looking. And take a look at the skill sets that are going to be in demand tomorrow, and start in the homes and in the schools and with the partnerships with the private sector, because these things are changing so terribly quickly. I mean, one of the things that I underlined in the little monograph that was outside was about the purpose of the book is to conceptualize a set of policies that favor job productivity, that create more and better jobs. So it touched on the panel this morning. I mean, we've got a couple of things, competing dynamics here. We're trying to fill existing jobs, but we're also trying to do some trend spotting, and we're trying to build economies with good, sustainable kinds of jobs. And that's, the workforce. I mean, this is the workforce of the future. I mean, she who has the best talent, the best skilled workforce is going to find that commerce and business are going to go there to get the stuff done. We saw that with the outsourcing. We're seeing it a little bit with some of the insourcing. But for the United States, I mean, the data, we have fallen so far behind the rest of the world. Whereas one time we were kind of leaders in terms of some of the skill sets. It's not just STEM skills anymore. If you take a look at the PISA scores, you see that the United States is now falling in around 30 with regard to both science and math and comprehension reading. Tremendous societal implications. So, I mean, it is about educational systems and skills.
Aneesh, what do you see as well? I assume it has to do with technology.
Well, I'm going to beat a dead horse, but I'll say it again. If you're an employer today, and you've just made a very strong case, the quality of the message out about what they're looking for may be highly variable in the economy. These are private employers trying to communicate what they're looking for. If we had a method by which the convening role and maybe some of the encouraging role for those who are participating directly with the bank on projects could do a better job elevating the quality of their job postings, that makes it easier for the labor markets to consume the information, because the source of it is ultimately the employer. And there isn't really, to my knowledge, a very well-organized effort to encourage those job postings to be made in a more higher quality manner. The UK government right now has issued a voluntary industry standard request. Please improve the quality of your job postings. and they've borrowed our US job posting schema as the open, free data standard on which that information can be made available. There may be a role in that regard as well. But let's get to that simple question. What are the talent pool skills, and what are the jobs that are in demand, and how might we do a better job on the transparency side? The matching will happen in all kinds of clever ways, but let's get the source data out.
Bruno, you agree with what's been said? Or?
Oh, yes, I agree with this message. But see, if we think about what IDB can bring, I think that the reports which have been written, they are just great. They are agendas, so there are already so much thing which has been done. Well, I think that the next step would be to try to understand better and to help with the implementation of various of the ideas which are in the report, but with the care of measuring the impact. Excuse me, to go back to my idea as a scientific, to measure what is the impact of all the various interventions which are proposed in the report. There are a lot of propositions which are very interesting, with a global view, which is really a deep understanding of what are the problems, and various solutions which are proposed. Well, I think it's very important now to go into the details to see what are the most important things to do, and probably I would say that going into this direction of providing information to job seekers, to employers about the possibilities is something which has probably a very, very large, that's my own intuition, very large return, because the costs are very, very small. The costs are very small. And then to collect information, and then to disseminate information, the cost is very, very, very small. And so the return, exactly, and then the return, therefore, are very large. And there are also other proposals which are in the proposition, which are in the report, and maybe you can consider that there are also very good ideas and can be very, with very large return. But I think it's important to go into the field and to see whether or not those interventions, they work or they don't work progressively, step by step, in order to be able to build a set of good services to offer.
Before we go into more of the audience questions, I have a question for Ramona that I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address this, which is the question of migrant workers, indigenous, other priority, other critical groups. I think might get lost in this discussion potentially. And so how can we best ensure that broad-based public employment services can be made applicable to some of those priority groups that might potentially be disengaged from some of the systems that we're talking about here and are so critical, especially across the world, but especially in our region?
Well, I think we all know that these groups that are maybe on the margin of the labor market now represent a tremendous untapped source or underutilized source of talent. In terms of migrants, they also say the best integration is a job. Obviously, for a lot of migrants, they're coming with low levels of skills. So there's a tremendous catch-up. So I don't think it's really completely a job for the public employment services or the private employment services. The people that come that already have good qualification, there's a role for mediation of public employment services to speed up the credential recognition and ease the transition. And a lot of countries do some pre-departure integration services. The International Organization for Migration does that. Canada's quite active in doing pre-integration before departure. But that's quite a different situation than we're talking about refugees, for example. So I think that's really a full societal effort. And I think, there needs to be a definition of priorities, and it has to be based not just in sort of the immediate, but looking at the medium and longer term, and often past the electoral cycle that governs a lot of actions that are dictated in the public sector by the government of the day.
Yeah. Another question from the audience here is the idea of exploiting technology and I'll read as open standards is great, but how do we adapt it to developing countries where there aren't many job postings necessarily available online, and this high, Ramona's mentioning right now, this high degree of informality that often exists. You know, in some countries, you know, approaching near 50% or whatnot. And so how can you take the public employment, the private employment services to, I would say, maybe help to reduce informality and at the same time be able to use technology to make sure that those jobs are actually available online? I'll start with you, Aneesh.
Well, just India, I visited a rural village, no paved roads, no what I would consider to be traditional models of infrastructure, no plumbing, what have you, but the government invested in a fiber broadband connection to the village hut. They call these the e-panchayats. Panchayats are the village centers in India. And it was remarkable. In 90 days, they introduced this fiber connection, and then President Obama visited at the end of the 90 days. And already, their entire lives had been upended, not because they went from someone had a job opening and then they wrote it on a postcard. They leapfrogged all of that and went straight. So literally, a young man was getting his graduate MBA program remotely because he could care for his mother in the village and then have an economic future. And he didn't have to choose between the two. And no one in the village was told this was coming. Literally, because the president was coming, they said, we're going to put a fiber thing into that village. I think that's how it happened. And the life upended. So there is a question mark societally about whether we are building infrastructure in our countries in the right manner. And then many of these things will naturally happen. It may be text messages that may be the best method by which people communicate demand. It may be other channels that are, in India they have this other bizarre model where if you want to get information, you make a phone call but you don't answer it, and then you can get incoming calls free, but you can't do outcoming calls. You got to pay for that. So they have this whole model where now the Prime Minister of India is saying, call this number but hang up, and then we'll call you. Like, fine, that's the thing. So, but it is natural to reach more people. And so as you can, if you provide the capacity for it, it will be used. You don't have to beg someone to use the internet to post something. And the internet may be, many things to many people. It will happen. I would start with the basic proposition. Whatever your method is to collect the demand signal, you can harvest it and make it widely available. Even if the source of that information is a piece of paper in a survey collected once every few weeks, it's better than nothing. Take it and make it available.
But to that point, I think that, and we've seen this utilized in the United States. So, the industry represents companies that source, physicians and accountants and lawyers and engineers and scientists and the entire job continuum. But we've also got companies that are in the day labor space. I mean, these are the people that do the heavy stuff to clean up the job sites, things that have to get done in America. And for many, many years, the only way to get to that group was to have them come to a job site early in the morning at 5 o'clock, not in the nicest part of town typically, and they'd be lining up at that job site. All of a sudden, and it's not the smartest of phones, but it's a little portable device. Yeah, a little portable device that you can buy for almost nothing. And you're exactly right. Text messaging all of a sudden broke the bonds between people that didn't have private transportation, and they didn't need to show up every single morning to get that assignment. And it has transformed that piece of the business.
Bruno, in some of your research, and there's a question from the audience, is how is some of the ways in which we are, the changes in the way we work, how is that going to redefine life in cities, especially some emergencies? How is it going to redefine housing, mobility, urban development? Have you, in your research, come across how some of these changes in employer matching and job provision services, how that's potentially starting to affect the way life is in certain emerging cities? Have you looked at how life could potentially be changing in cities across in developing countries based on how the nature of work is changing? Have you seen this? And I'll throw this open to the panel as well. Others have potentially seen how this more mobile way in which we're working, how the way in which jobs are being shared, the skills match and whatnot. Is that changing the way that the way of life actually in certain cities?
Yes, I think so. For example, this, if I can, there is this very interesting experiment which has been done by Robert Jensen in India, where he made available information and labor market services to match people in villages with some opportunities. And so it did that as a randomized control trial with some villages which were control and some villages which were the treatment villages in which he did the intervention. And so actually the results are very, very interesting, because what you see, the main result is that so a lot of women actually went to work in those new opportunities, but you saw also a lot of other changes. You saw that those women, then they decided they want to start training. And before, they didn't even think about it. Also, you see that within the household of these villages, not only the people who went to get a work, then the children, they get more frequently to school. The attendance to education was more important. And the young women within the villages, they decided to be married less frequently. So there was a lot of changes which are associated to the fact that people, they find a job, but also the way they consider the future as a broad level.
They see many more opportunities.
Opportunities,
many more opportunities, lifestyle changes. Well, we're about out of time, and I know we're hitting the lunch hour, so we don't want to go into the lunch hour. But I think as we started this panel, first of all, I want to thank the panelists for an absolutely excellent conversation. If everyone could just join me in thanking the panelists for an excellent conversation. We set out in the beginning, I said, to talk about proposals of how to solve the mismatched ideas of how the government can be a facilitator and the role of the IDB and public-private partnerships. And I think that this panel gave us some really great insight into how to do all that. And then I also want to thank Hector and Sylvain and Miguel for their great opening thoughts to really set the stage for this, and of course Dulce for her great presentation and an overview of the book. And even though she gave an overview of the book, please do read the book. So again, thank you, and thank you to the IDB, to WAPES, and to the OECD for inviting me to moderate this.